Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead.
So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Joanna Farrar, and I am the host of Coffee and Divination. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome John Michael Greer to Coffee and Divination today. And he is a well-known author writing in a variety of genres and topics, including ecology, politics, appropriate technology, oil depletion, druidry, divination, and magic in so many different forms. The number of books and the titles are too many for me to list here. If you're not familiar with his writings, you really should be at this point, and you should take a look at his blog. He wrote for many years, starting in 2006, the Archdruid report, which is now echosophia.net, and that is a blog that is followed by many, many people. I have had the pleasure of reading his writings for many years through that. And from 2003 to 2015, he was the Grand Archdruid of the Ancient Order of Druids in America. For all of those reasons and so many more, I am honored to welcome John Michael Greer here tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on.
So one of my first questions, I'm not going to ask you to relate to all of us how you got started in the occult, because I think we don't need to go that far back. But given that this is a podcast that primarily focuses on divination, I wanted to ask you what some of your first experiences with the arts of divination were. Were there people in your family that practiced it, like TV reading?
No. Actually, it's going to come down to how I got involved in the occult, because that's how I got involved in divination.
Sure.
It's quite simple. I grew up in the South Seattle suburbs in the late 60s and early 70s. Think of your generic plastic suburb. Okay, all the nice, everything nicely groomed, everything 100% plastic, boring as all get out. If you're an intelligent, bookish child growing up in this kind of environment, being told, hey, this is wonderful, this is all there is to life, it was kind of a hellscape. And so I was interested in anything that was less two-dimensional than the world that was being presented to me by the media and the schools and my parents and so on and so forth. So I was into werewolf trivia. I was into all kinds of unexplained phenomena. You name it, I was interested in it. But bit by bit, I started noticing that there was this thing, this occultism, magic, divination. There was this cluster of things off there in the middle distance that wasn't just a matter of, wow, read this cool thing about werewolves or what have you. It's actually something you did. And so one thing led to another. Eventually, I was able to find some books. This was in the middle phases of the great paperback boom of the 1970s, when you can get paperbacks on anything in supermarket, book racks. And so I launched into my study of occultism. And one of the things I encountered, actually two of the things I encountered first, were tarot on the one hand and geomancy on the other. Of course, tarot is extremely famous these days. Most people know what a tarot deck is. Geomancy, much less so, but it so happened that one of the books that I picked up earliest as a textbook of occultism was one of the two authors was one of the people involved in helping to revive geomancy. And so I was going, wow, this is cool. So I piled into it. And of course, I did so very much on my own, without any particular help from teachers or anything. I was, again, a bookish, kind of shy. They didn't have the term Asperger's syndrome in those days, but that's what it was. And so I was doing this entirely on my own. I was collecting books and this kind of stuff, and quite a few years passed before I finally started meeting other people who were involved in this kind of thing. In case anyone wonders, Mary K. Greer and me, we may be distant cousins. An enormous number of people, when I first got into print, thought that I was like Mary K. Greer's son or her boyfriend or something like that. She is a marvelous person, but we're not related.
At least not closely enough that you would know about that. That's not.
Yeah, exactly. We call each other cousin. Because we are probably descended from the same subset of the same Scottish clan on our paternal sides, but that's about it. That's about it. But yeah, so basically, I got into divination because I picked up some books that had to do with magic and occultism, and there it was. And I said, okay, well, that sounds cool. And I proceeded to charge into the whole subject with my the typical 11-year-old gullibility. But I was enthusiastic. I was interested. I made my first tarot deck, hand drawn, horribly ugly. I'm not a very good artist. On index cards.
Wow, that's quite impressive.
Yeah, exactly. But then, of course, I finally saved up the money after a little while to get a Rider-Waite deck and proceeded from there. But yeah, so that's basically how I started. Nobody in my family was into this kind of thing. They were, very comfortably suburban American, not even sufficiently concerned with spiritual things to be properly agnostic, just more apathetic than anything else. None of them. My dad still thinks that this stuff is really weird, but I'm making a living at it, so he's cool with it.
Yes. So you drew your own, and then got a Rider-Waite deck.
And then went out to a Rider-Waite deck. Went on from there to David Palladini's Aquarian deck, and I've got about 30 decks at this point.
And we're not going to focus a lot on tarot in this interview, but I'm really curious. When you do use tarot, what are some of your go-to decks? What are the ones that you tend to favor?
It's a mix. I like the Aquarian deck. That was my standard. David Palladini's Aquarian deck was my standard deck for like 30 years. It was the one that I turned to first because I tend to get good clear readings with it. The Rider-Waite I like using for meditation because Pamela Colvin Smith, working with Arthur Edward Waite, put a lot of very, very deep stuff into it. And so as a meditative deck, I prefer it to, say, Crowley's Thoth deck, which is not, which is great symbolically, but ugly. Let's see, other tarot decks there's a deck called the Merlin Tarot, which is kind of an idiosyncratic deck by R.J. Stewart and Miranda Gray, and it has its own set of symbolism and so on. But that's another one that I tend to use a lot. It works well for me, and I like the symbolism. Let's see. For tarot decks, one that I recently got was the Wagner Ring Cycle Tarot. I've forgotten the name of the compiler, but it was actually made. Yeah, it was made from 19th century. I'm going to forget the artist. Arthur Rackham did a complete set of illustrations to the Ring of the Nibelung.
That would be a beautiful deck, I'm sure.
Yeah, and so the person who put the deck together basically cropped and trimmed and chopped and made a 78 card deck of Arthur Rackham ring images. And as I am a crazed Wagner fan, of course I had to have that. And I've just started using it, and it's pretty good. It is responding very well.
I will definitely want to look that up. My husband
I would say check it out.
Wagner fan, so.
Oh, good. Sweet. Okay. Yeah. Well, there we go.
I am slightly less so, though I do enjoy playing it. It's the art. I know the artwork you're talking about is gorgeous. I would love to see that as a tarot deck. So that's
pretty. It's stunning. It really works well.
So going into geomancy, because I know that is something that you have done such a service for all of us in terms of the work you've done within geomancy and bringing that more forward in the occult world, shall we say. How you mentioned a book on geomancy and kind of diving into that early on. Can you tell us a little bit more about how your journey into geomancy?
Oh, sure. The book in question, I still have my copy of it, was Techniques of High Magic by Francis King and Stephen Skinner. Stephen Skinner is really the founder of the modern geomancy renaissance. I'm not sure where he ran across it, probably in the Golden Dawn stuff, but he started doing books on geomancy and related subjects when I was still just getting into this stuff. And he's still active, he's still out there. But he did a geomancy chapter for this book, Techniques of High Magic, and he did several other books. And I thought it was really cool, and I gathered a couple of other books, but it was very limited. The material that was available it didn't have a lot of divinatory depth. The Golden Dawn version of it, you'd go through this elaborate process and come up with something and look up something up on the table, and it would say, evil except for bloodletting.
Yes.
How very useful. So I was kind of frustrated by this, and I worked with it and tried to get a sense. What happened then was I went to college in the very early 1980s and left after 3 years without a degree. I'd had 6 majors in that time, and I'm sure you know that story. And so, but I ended up going back to college in the early 1990s to finish my degree. And while I was there, I had picked up one of the things I was there to do was pick up a good grasp of Latin, which I knew I needed for my occult studies. And while I was there, I managed to find a book in French, which I did not read at that time, but which had as an appendix a Latin text by Pietro di Albano, who was a very famous Renaissance occultist, which was a text on how to interpret geometric charts. I was going, wow, what an interesting thing. So I photocopied the thing from the book and proceeded to use my still slightly novice grasp of Latin to translate it. And I think I was about a page and a half into the ink-smeared notebook that I was going when my jaw literally just about bounced off my lap, because it had techniques of a level of clarity that I had never seen anybody discuss anywhere else. Techniques for setting up a geometric chart and then reading off clear yes/no answers. All this kind of stuff was great. So I proceeded to translate the whole thing. It was actually published as an appendix to my first book in geomancy, on geomancy, earth divination, earth magic. And I just went to town. I took that technique and I proceeded to plunge into a whole series of other old books on geomancy. My Latin improved rather sharply in the process, and so I ended up with this toolkit of techniques that really made geomancy speak to me well. And so I started doing a lot of geomancy, and I learned a couple of things very early about geomancy. The first and most important is that the kind of divination that's very vague and very feel-oriented and very, kind of general and sort of gives you the emotional tone of the thing. None of that is geomancy. Geomancy is cut and dried. It gives you clear yes/no answers for real, straight-up answers for real-world questions. And it is the second thing, of course, came from that, which is a very risky thing to do this for people at, say, a pagan event or an occult fair or something like that, because they will ask you, will I achieve my greatest dream? And you cast the thing, and it says no.
Yes.
They're not happy.
Mm-hmm.
I have not actually had anybody fling, a handful of coins into my face, but it came close on a couple of occasions. So geomancy is a great oracle if you're interested in the straight up facts. It is a very poor oracle if you want hand holding.
Yes, there's not a lot of gray areas possible sometimes in its bluntness.
Exactly.
Just to take a step slightly backwards for a moment, I think a lot of people that are listening to this will probably be familiar with geomancy and may already have read your books on that. But can you briefly describe for people what the art of geomancy is?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Basically, geomancy uses a set of 16 4-digit binary numbers. You can say that these days, and most people know what you mean. They're basically combinations of 1 dot or 2 dots. There are 4 of them in a vertical column. It's like the I Ching, how you have the straight lines and the broken lines, except it's groups of 4 rather than groups of 6. Probably comes from sub-Saharan Africa originally, by the way. There are a lot of divination systems in there that have that same kind of, 4-digit binary number divinations. But you use any random number, or try that again, any random method, any randomizing method, whether flipping coins, rolling dice, complicated things involving sand and a stick. There's all kinds of methods of doing it, to generate 4 of these figures, and then you combine them in certain ways and come up with a geometric chart, which is a whole series of different positions. Each one has its own meaning. And then you interpret that the way you'd interpret any other divination. One of the tricks, though, is that certain specific relations in a geometric chart give you a definite yes or a definite no. And that's one of the things that makes it really very distinctive among, sort of the run-of-the-mill divination methods. There's a straightforward way for it to say, yes, this will succeed. Or, yes, this will succeed, but you're going to have to work at it. Or, yes, this will succeed, but you need help. Or, no.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it's some people call it the I Ching of the West because it doesn't have the long philosophical books connected to it, but it does have that basic binary structure, and it's a little fussy to learn. Certainly a little more so than, say, just shuffling a deck of cards. But once you've learned it, I've taught it to literally hundreds of people at this point in workshops. And by the end of a 2-day workshop, everybody's casting geomancy charts and reading them. It's quite straightforward.
I really enjoyed your books on that and have recommended them to many people. And I know I've heard from other people that your books were their sort of main entryway into the art of geomancy. And geomancy, since the time you published those books, has become recently more and more popular, which is, I think, wonderful, because I think it's a wonderful art that should be practiced more. How do you feel about the renaissance of geomancy? Why do you think it is coming so much more to the fore as an art again?
Well, that's a good question. It has been a slow process. But let's see. I mean, my first geomancy book was published in 2000, I think it was, right around then. And so it's been a slow process, but it has really picked up in recent years. I think part of it is the same thing that's been driving a certain amount of attention to other divination methods, like the Lenormand deck, that don't give you a lot of wiggle room. Because a lot of divination systems went way far into the sort of touchy-feely end of things. What do you want this to mean is kind of satirical, but too often it turned into that. And I think a lot of people actually want answers. I know a lot of people who've taken up the Lenormand deck precisely because, the answer's right there. There isn't a lot of room to wiggle. And geomancy is the same way. You cast a geomantic reading, you live with the consequences because it's going to tell you. And I think especially at this point, there's been, we've kind of had our plunge into wishful thinking. I'm sure most of our listeners recall The Secret. The whole positive thinking thing. If you just tell the universe what you want, when you wish upon a star, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't work too well, as we've all found out repeatedly now. And I think a lot of people are actually getting to the point that they want straight up, real world answers from their divination system. And geomancy is very well prepared for that. Very well suited to that kind of question. That's a guess on my part. I'd be very interested to see somebody doing a study or something and saying, here's here are the 23 reasons that people take up geomancy. But unless I get the funding, I don't think that's likely to happen soon. Oh,
that also sounds like that could be rather a not very good article as well. So, depending on who did it.
Yeah.
Well, you've kind of answered one of my follow-up questions was going to be why geomancy, if you were explaining to someone why, they should learn this. I think that a lot of those reasons that you've just enumerated say that very clearly. But in some cases, are there situations where you feel geomancy would not be the art that if somebody came to you and said, I have this question, would there be a circumstance where you'd say, yeah, maybe not geomancy, maybe
good heavens, yes.
Go. And if so, like what would kind of push you in another direction?
Okay. Precisely because, geomancy, even the word means earth divination. It's very practical. It's very down to earth. If you want to know subtleties about, relationships and things like that, if you want to know the feely stuff, the things having to do with the emotional world and with interpersonal connections and so on, those 16 figures are a bit of a blunt instrument. They will give you a clear answer, but they may not give you a detailed answer. And so this is one of the things that the tarot is frankly best at. If say you want to sit down and somebody wants to know, here is this relationship that I'm having with my significant other, with my coworker, with my parent, or what have you. I want to understand all these various forces that are causing confusion. You want to go to something like tarot, because those 78 different snapshot possibilities plus their combinations are going to give you a lot more information. It's a lot more useful. And other than that, of course, the other thing is simply that different people have different responses to divination. I've known several people who, for some reason, they could get really good readings on geomancy on any subject that didn't have to do with money. If it has to do with money, they would constantly get wrong, straight up wrong readings, where they'd get the reading and, it'd say, yes, you'll get the job, and they wouldn't get the job, or what have you. And so somebody like that probably needs to do something else anytime they have a money-related question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's that kind of what you just said about the only 16 figures. So 16 is that's very different from Tarot. It's even it's less than Ogham and certain other like runes and things like that. So it has that limitation, which I don't. It works differently, obviously, because you can have repeated characters, which some of those other systems can't. But it's also led to the issue of people very easily saying, well, X plus X with that as the judge means evil except for bloodletting.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why you have to be a little more flexible than that.
Yeah, I think that then that goes into the. It's a little early for where I was planning to go with this, but it might as well go with it now. It's that age-old question of how much can be done by rote memorizing, meanings of things, meanings of combinations of the left witness and the right witness and the judge and the sentence and all that. And how much is intuitive or beyond that and just kind of the skill of the diviner. You know what I mean? That's not what you can just get out of a book. And I think, arguably, I would think some of Geomancy's reason for getting shelved was because people weren't doing that subtlety anymore. They lost that, and it started to weaken.
Exactly. Yeah, when you treat geomancy in a purely mechanical fashion and just read things out of the book, like any other oracle, it falls flat. You've got to have that intuitive dimension, or you're not going to get good results. And so, yeah, there was a lot of tendency in the late Renaissance and thereafter, where geomancy survived at all, to reduce it to this very mechanical kind of process, where you just go ka-thunk, 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 and out comes a reading. And they weren't very accurate, precisely because you've got to be, let's say you've done a chart. You've got, I mostly prefer to do the house chart rather than the shield chart. Okay, so the house, for those of our readers or those of our listeners who haven't gotten that, there are two ways you can lay out the figures. The house chart is derived from astrology. So you have 12 houses, just like the 12 houses of a horoscope. And so the house chart is the one that has all the neat stuff that Pietro Giordano talked about, and that's why I tend to use it. But so yeah, you've got your figure in this house and your figure in that house, and you've got the relationship between them, whatever that might be. But you really need to relate that to the situation, to relate that to your intuition, to let it tell you a story. There's an extent to which all divination is the art of storytelling. And if you learn how to let it tell the story to you and then tell the story to yourself or to the querent, then interesting things actually start happening. It's not just a sort of mechanical thing.
So I think that also kind of relates to a question that I've heard that I've discussed with a lot of other people, and I have a couple of times asked guests on the show before, their feeling of how essential the question is to divining. In the sense that, like, some people will do, I can do this more easily with Tarot, the idea of doing like a daily draw, of saying like, well, I'm just going to have a draw for the day and see what that is. And some people are in favor of that because it helps you kind of see how that might unfold in your day. And other people say, no, that's useless because you need to have a question. You have to have context in order to have meaning. Like, does that apply with geomancy, would you say, or is it different?
In my experience, geomancy is one of the most question-dependent divinations there is. You have to have certainly if you're going to do the house chart, you have to have a question, because without a question, you have no basis for interpretation. You can do a shield chart without a question, but even then it's not going to tell you much, because, in correspondence with what? There are ways you can do a daily chart or a weekly chart or a monthly chart or a yearly chart, but they're very specialized. And normally speaking, when I was doing a lot of geomatic divination at pagan events and so on, I would say, you have to have a question. If you don't have a question, I can't give you the answer. And so, but that really varies from oracle to oracle. In my experience, there are some oracles. It's doing a daily reading with something very simple. This is me, this is my situation, this is my outcome, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Is perfectly effective. You get good results that way. I've never really had much luck doing just a single card or a single. I want those three so I have some context. But some oracles are really good with that. OM is one that I've had really good results doing that kind of thing with. Mm-hmm. My orphan child, the Sacred Geometry Oracle, which, thank you, is going to be out again in a better form in April, is another one that works very well with that. But Geomancy wants a question.
Mm-hmm. So that it can be blunt with its answer, yes.
Yeah, exactly. You ask me a question, you got to listen to the answer. That's, Geomancy always, to me, has this kind of Brooklyn accent. What do you want?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whether you like the answer or not, you will get it.
Whether you like it or not, you're gonna take the answer.
So I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit to talking philosophy. Kind of talking about the philosophy and thoughts on how this works and why this works and things of that nature, just in mm-hmm. slightly more general terms with divination.
Oh, sure.
I think it's in one of your geomancy books. You mention the concepts of natura naturata and natura mm-hmm. naturans, and mm-hmm. how that relates to sort of the view of divination and magic in the Renaissance and Middle Ages. It's kind mm-hmm. of how the forces of nature or, omens in the mm-hmm. world are very much a part of being able to divine appropriately. And I was wondering if you could just explain those terms a little bit.
Yeah, natura naturans and natura naturata, Latin jargon. If you happen to be up to your eyeballs in medieval and Renaissance philosophy, you already know these things, but that's not a common study these days. But the idea is we encounter nature in two contexts. We encounter nature in things that have been brought into being. Let me start. The word nature comes from the word for the verb to be born. Okay, nature is the things that are born. Mm-hmm. Nature is also the things that are bearing, that are giving birth. So you can look at the things that are born. You look at the things that are made by nature, and that happen by, quote, chance, unquote, as we like to call it in our present superstitious era. And you can look and you can encounter nature that way. And behind that, you get a sense of nature as a process that is always giving birth to things, that is always creating new things. And this is why people in the Middle Ages and Renaissance understood that randomization, what we call randomization, is a way to figure out what the universe is up to. Because nature is constantly giving birth. Natura naturans, the birther giving birth. And what she is creating is an expression of what she's up to. Mm-hmm. So if you are paying attention to what spontaneously happens, whether that's omens, whether that's the randomization process of geomancy, whether it's the shuffle of cards, even though they didn't do that yet in the Middle Ages, you can get an idea of what nature is up to, and thus where she's going to be going with that. And so natura naturata, the nature as the things being born, or the things that have been born, becomes your key to natura naturans, nature as the birther, the giving birth, the source of things.
Yeah, which then relates back to classical forms of divination like augury, because then if you're seeing that, you can see it in so many different seemingly random but not random events. Yeah,
exactly, because the idea of a random event did not exist in classical or medieval or Renaissance philosophy. The idea was if human beings are not doing it deliberately, then it's being done by nature. And since it's being done by nature, it's being done by nature, and it's not just happening by itself. So if you want to know what the universe is up to. And there was a lot of, people tend to miss this when they think about the Middle Ages. People have a very confused idea of medieval philosophy. The idea of nature as a conscious being, as a power. You wouldn't say then a goddess, because that was a very uncomfortable term in those days. But the idea was there, basically this immense feminine presence that was secondary to the Christian Trinity, but created by the Trinity and given power over the earth and told, okay, play with it. That was a common idea in medieval times. It was normal. It was just people took that as a matter of course. And so that played a very large role in how they understood divination and how they understood a lot of other things.
Yes, and I wanted to. Yeah, I actually want to read something from I don't remember which of your two Geomancy books this is from. I'm sorry, I put a little quote in here in my notes. Don't remember which one I took it from, but in any case,
I may not remember either.
I do assure you that it is something you wrote, though. That I do know.
Okay.
So I wanted to read just this section of a paragraph, which has to do with forces, kind of very much related to what you were just saying, and how earlier peoples looked at divination as opposed to other forms of action. And I'll just read this and then ask my question. So, in most of today's occult traditions, ritual magic takes the central role divination had in earlier times. And practitioners of modern magic spend much of their time learning how to raise power and direct it into their magical work. You won't find a word about raising power in Renaissance magical texts, however, because Renaissance occultists relied on the currents of power that exist around us at every moment. The shifting patterns made by those currents could be tracked in many ways, but geomancy was one of the most valued. So it's basically, Could you? Yes,
I can tell you which of my books that's from. That's from the art and practice of geomancy.
Okay. This was a test. You did well. Excellent. Yes.
Okay.
My question is basically, so I find that really, obviously, I have a podcast on divination, so I'm fascinated with it. I think it is really exceptionally important in our magical practices in our lives. So I found that really useful and important to think with about the central role of that and how it is not, it's different from necessarily where our focus is sometimes these days.
Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
No, that's grasping that difference, and there's kind of a story as to how I actually understood that. That was really important for getting a sense of what the differences between our modern magical tradition and the much broader and more ancient traditions out of which it's partly derived. Because we're used to understanding the world as something we do things to, and that's not necessarily healthy. In the Renaissance and before, the idea was you experience the world as something that you participate in, and where the power is not in you. Or rather, if there is power in you, there's a fairly modest amount. The power is in the cosmos, and the question is, are you clever enough to sort of surf the waves of it?
Yes, and that power can be conceived of depending on who's doing the perceiving as gods, as forces of nature, as saints, ancestors. Your context may vary, would you say?
Yes, but it varied certainly from about the time of Socrates to the scientific revolution in the Western world. It didn't vary that much. Whatever you called the source of all things, whether you were a Neoplatonist and simply referred to it as Diane the One, or whether you were a Christian and referred to it as God, or what have you, there was this idea that there is a source of all the creative energy, and energies cascade down through various planes of being from this source to the world that we know. And in the process, it sort of does almost like a pinball game where it's going boink, 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 bouncing off each of the planets on the way down and bouncing off various beings and so on. And of course, the planets were understood to be intelligent beings. But there are all these entities, and so saints or ancestors or gods or angels or, fill in the blank. The world was thought to be very, very full of different beings at that time. And all of them participate in these cascading currents of energy from the source of all things into the world that we experience. And everything in our world comes into being, is sustained in being, and goes out of being as a result of these cascading flows of energy. So it's more a matter of, the differences between the pagan Neoplatonist sorcerer like Iamblichus, or the Christian wizard, or the Jewish wizard, or the early modern Hermeticist, was mostly a matter of detail. They all had the same broad scheme, and it was purely a matter, in many cases, of what do you call the power that inhabits the sun, let's say? Do you call that an archangel, or do you call that a god? Take your pick.
Yeah. And I think, if I'm recalling, some of the classical ideas of divination was also that there was a lot of care and concern to know that you couldn't really know the will or the minds of the gods anyway. So you were kind of just trying to align yourself as best with their will or with the forces that were already in play. But you weren't trying to say, like, I can know the specific future. But it's about aligning yourself with the forces at play as the best you can.
Yeah, and also listening, because the gods are trying to tell you what to do. The gods are trying to communicate this stuff. If human beings will simply shut up and listen, unless the gods have, for some reason, have decided to mess with you, in which case you're in trouble. Typically, the whole point of religion was to maintain good relations with the gods and goddesses, so that they would warn you and guide you and say, okay, now's the time you want to do this. And so you did your religious rituals and you did your religious practices and you did divination to give them, the way to say, okay, now. And which is why, the reason it's called divination. It's literally listening to the gods.
Yeah. Yeah, I really could not agree more with that. In our modern conceptions of divination, it has become such an emphasis on active and how can I get to what I want? What is do as thou wilt? What is my will that I'm imposing on the world, as opposed to being able to sit back and listen and actually, align with what's already happening. And that's something that I think has been lost quite a bit. And that's an important part of a healthy system of magical training. How do you, I assume you think that learning divination is a very important part of magical training systems?
Oh, it's absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential. The three legs of the cauldron of basic magical training that I teach to people these days. 3 basic daily practices. Some kind of basic ritual work, to typically like a banishing ritual, or there are certain rituals they use to cleanse your energy body and to fill it with positive energies. That's one. The second one is discursive meditation, which is not mind emptying, but meditation that actually uses the mind to think more clearly and explore symbols and so on. That's the second one. And a daily divination is the third. And those 3, just every single day, that's, to my mind, that's the core of effective occult training. Everything else beyond that is lagniappe.
And it has to be built on that solid foundation.
It has to be built on that foundation, yeah. You've got the 3-footed cauldron, and everything else that goes into the cauldron is supported by those 3 strong feet.
So really coming back a little bit more to the specifics of a system of divination then, because what we were talking about there, and several points earlier, we're talking about how, there are established meanings, there are traditions, there are things that have meaning because without boundaries, without limits, without things that we say those 16 figures mean that we found to be true, then we can't say anything meaningful with them. We have to have a harmonic system in order to have music and such things like that.
Exactly. Thank you, by the way. I think you've just overturned about 150 years of modern music, but it's a good thing.
Oh, yes. Well, classical violinist who really likes Beethoven, so
I get this. One of my novels is about a young composer who ends up going for Baroque, if you want to say that, who ends up writing Baroque music instead of the latest fashionable stuff. And so,
you should talk to Daryl more about that, because my husband's the composer, not myself.
Oh, sweet.
But he definitely would agree with you on that. I won't draw him into this conversation. It's my podcast,
he should definitely pick up a copy of my novel, The Shoggoth Concerto. It's about classical music and Shoggoths.
Okay, I'm sure he's nodding in the other room, and I'm sure he's going to. So, but my question goes back to, though. So obviously technique is important, and we have to have that foundation. But then we already said that you can get stuck in the listing, and I'm just going to read it out of the book. So how do we keep that beginner's mind, that like openness to the fact that things can have new meanings, that the gods or the spirits of the universe can have like a completely new interpretation for us that may not match what's in the book? And I've had so many conversations with people that are saying, but how do I do that? How do I know if it's not just me wishful thinking versus, no, I think this time it means this different thing?
You're asking one of the basic questions of human existence, and it's one that, for example, Aristotle explored in detail. One of the things that people tend to get confused about. So many people think the opposite of a bad idea is a good idea. You have the verb. Okay, not so. The opposite of one bad idea is another bad idea. The good idea is halfway in between them. And so being absolutely rigid and dogmatic, and this can only mean what it meant in 1352, that's one kind of stupidity. And this means whatever I want it to mean. That's another kind of stupidity. Somewhere in between, there's that shifting point of balance. Finding it is not easy, but life isn't easy. Now, one way that you can work on that very effectively, and this is one of the reasons that I strongly recommend that daily meditation or daily divination I mentioned a moment ago. It's very simple. When you do your daily divination, write down your interpretation of it. Then go back the next day and look at your interpretation. See, okay, this is the geomancy chart I cast for the day. This is what I thought it meant. This is what actually happened during the day. Oh, that's what Fortuna Minor was actually talking about. And that process of going back, it's the basic process of science. You check the results of your theories against facts by means of experiment. So every daily divination becomes an experiment. Every interpretation you do is your best guess as to the results, and then you check that day after day, and pretty soon you start noticing, okay, Fortuna Minor, every time that comes up, it's this. Oh, so that's, I need to morph my notion of what Fortuna Minor means a little bit to include this particular cluster of things. And so it becomes very effectively self-correcting once you start doing that, once you check your work against the results. This can be very, very trying if you have a lot of emotions invested in the outcome, and of course that's the common thing generally. This is why, do it every day, do it privately. Don't announce loudly, "Ooh, I had Fortuna Minor here. That means I'm going to get XYZ." No, don't make a fool of yourself that way. Just note it down. Revisit it a day later, make your corrections. The next day you say, next time Fortuna Minor comes up, said, no, that probably doesn't mean that because it didn't mean that 3 days ago. I bet it means, let's retry that. Maybe it means this. And that way, over time, you can work out a very, very subtle and detailed sense of what each figure means alone and in combination.
Yeah, through actually examining results.
Yeah, and that's basically, if I may broaden here, this is something I do constantly in my blog. People will say, well, what's going to, here's this horrible crisis, or here's this marvelous new whatchamacallit, and my question is always, okay, what happened the last time that was predicted? Or what happened the last time these events took place? And readers who are not used to my approach are usually left going, because they never thought to look back at history and use that as a source of examples. But that was the basis on which I called the 2008 real estate crash 2.5 years in advance. It was, if I may veer on a perhaps loaded issue, that was why I was able to predict in January of 2016 that Donald Trump would be elected president. I because I pay attention to history and because I'm used to these patterns. It's not any particular brilliance on my part. It's simply I have a good memory and I study history. So you can do the same thing with divination, and it keeps your divinations and your divination interpretations from getting wacko.
Mm-hmm. And it also allows you to discard things that aren't working rather than continuing to practice things that don't work or continuing a bad habit of something that you didn't even notice.
Exactly. If you keep on saying evil except for bloodletting, but you actually let some blood at that point and it didn't work out well, then obviously you need to change that.
Yes, hopefully not the bloodletting.
Not the blood. Leave the bloodletting. Unless you happen to be, a patient of an Ayurvedic physician who uses bloodletting or certain traditional Chinese medical practices use cupping as a practice, I believe. Yeah. And if it works, it works.
I kind of want to just kind of move a little bit away from geomancy to other forms of divination, which you have written about.
I've done that a few times.
Which includes a form of a alphabet of divination, which is not broadly known, shall we say? And I will pronounce it. It's the Welsh, so like I said, we'll see. Colbran alphabet.
Yeah.
Yes, and you wrote a lovely little book about that, which I really enjoyed.
Thank you.
And I wanted you to just, if you could tell people a little bit about it if they haven't heard about it.
Okay, sure. Basically, I think the best way to explain this is just to sort of describe my plunge into that thing. I got involved in the Druid scene back in the 1990s, and that's been one of the foundations of my spiritual life ever since. And this is not the ancient Druids. We don't know anything about them. For all practical purposes, their teachings are lost. What we have is what was called the Druid revival, which got going in the 18th century, people trying to reconstruct a Druid nature spirituality. And a lot of those people were Welsh. A lot of them were remarkably odd individuals, and one of the oddest of all was a guy named Edward Williams. Okay, bland name. The name he took was Iolo Morganwg. Iolo was a poet, a brilliant poet. He was one of the greatest forgers of his time. He could do medieval Welsh poems so good that it wasn't until the 1950s. This is a guy who died in like 1826, I think it was, and it wasn't until the 1950s that his forgeries were actually all caught. He was that good at faking medieval Welsh poetry. He was an opium addict. He was a very strange, very wild person. And one of the things he did in the course of his Druid bardic teachings was he introduced this alphabet called the Colbran, which, depending on which version, because there are several different versions of it that he claimed had existed at various points in history. But the one that I use in my book is 24 Colbran letters, so the same number of letters as there are runes in the standard Elder Plutarch. So you have these 24 letters. They look rather like runes. They're sort of straight lines and sharp angles. Each one of them corresponds to a sound in the usual sense, but also it draws its meaning from the sound. So that the letter A is if you put your mouth in the form that you need to say A, it's just open, it's comfortable, it's flowing freely, and that's what that letter means. It means free flowing. It means things just moving smoothly ahead, and that's what it means in divination. And so, if you take another one like E, okay, the letter E. If you feel how that E sounds, it's kind of choked, it's kind of strangled, it's sort of interrupted, and that's what that letter means. It means things have gotten wonky, things are sort of choked and strangled and blocked, and so on and so forth for all 24 of the letters. This was used by Welsh Druids and bards for a good long time. It may still be used by some, but it fell out of fashion. And I ended up having this long process of digging to find online scans of the one book that explained the symbolism of the letters so I could actually use it for divination. And that's what gave rise to my little book on the Colburn, because once I found that thing, I was going, woohoo, this is great. It makes for a good divination system. And that was where that came from.
And I think it's interesting because it hasn't been in favor. And like you said, it took you quite a journey in order to find that one source. And it brings up the interesting question of, of course, I will ask the question, what is the difference between validity and authenticity, and how that relates to things as varied as, I would say, Ogham and even runes and the Colburn and all sorts of other systems that we've sort of put back together, even the Greek systems of their alphabet oracles, which we have a little bit of some information on, but not complete. And how, what is that difference?
Well, the thing is, authenticity is how accurately does this imitate what was being done back whenever. Validity is, does it work? Now, authenticity is incredibly important if you are a museum curator. If you want to know, here is this rune stone, let's say, does it actually date to the 10th century? That's really important if you're a museum curator. If you are a diviner, authenticity isn't worth squat. It does not matter. This oracle may be as old as the bones of Moses and useless. This other oracle may have been made up last Thursday over pizza, and it's great. It gives nice, clear readings. Validity is all that matters for divination. Does it work? And, of course, that simply begs the question, because what works for one person may not work for another person. In the case of Colburn, is it authentic? I mean, is this the actual alphabet passed down to Iolo Morganwg by generations of Welsh bards in the hills of Glamorgan who had it from, the ancient Druids and all the way back to Higadarn in the dawn of time? No, of course it isn't. It has precisely the same relation to historic fact as, say, Wicca. Which was not practiced in the Neolithic. I'm sorry.
I learned from my grandmother in the forest.
Your third-degree grandmother in the New Forest. I'm convinced it's less so now than it used to be. But I used to think there was a granny factory in the New Forest that was turning out truckloads of third-degree grannies to distribute across the English-speaking world, because there were so many of them.
You just have to go there to find one. I mean,
exactly. These days, I think the trade has collapsed or something. Trade barriers, probably Trump put a tariff on them. But yeah, the thing is, it doesn't have to be ancient to work. It has been an endless source of amusement to me that very often the people who were insisting on absolute authenticity for this or that or the other would not think of using a computer that was 3 years old.
Yeah.
So, as far as anyone can tell, Iolo Morganwg made up the Colburn. He may have seen them in an opium dream, for all we know. But he came up. He cooked them up. He presented them. He got them out there. Various other Welsh bards and druids picked them up and ran with them and enriched them with their own work. And that's what better origin could you have? A crazed Welsh poet invented these things. What is not Celtic about that?
Absolutely poetic inspiration. I mean,
poetic
inspiration.
Exactly. Yeah, it does. So it does not have to date back to the dawn of time. It does not have to have been practiced by trilobites in the Devonian to be valid.
Well, also because that begs the question: then, if it has to date back that long, are you implying that the gods aren't around to inspire people anymore? And
that's a crucial point. That's a crucial point. What exactly inspired Iolo? I don't think anyone will ever know. But his oracle works, his most Druid revival ritual descends from the stuff that he invented. It's great. And so the Colburn's a lot of fun. It's a nice. It appeals to people for many of the same reasons the runes do, and it's not that dissimilar. But it has its own slant on things, because every one of the letters is a kind of process. It's how are things flowing is kind of the question that each letter asks, and so it really puts an interesting slant on things.
Yeah. I just find it really interesting because everyone talks about Ogham, which is wonderful, and we do have a little bit more historical background for that. But there's also a lot of historical questions around how that was used, and there's so many different opinions on that. You can pick up 3 different books and get so many different opinions.
And the fact remains that Ogham, as a modern divinatory oracle, was invented by Colin. He took the alphabet, turned it into an oracle, Colin Murray, in the 1970s. He just sat down and turned it into an oracle, very much doing the same kind of work that Yola Morgana did. And he did an excellent job. Yeah. And that's why Ogham is such a marvelous oracle these days, because he took this alphabet and said, I see how to make that one sing. And he did.
Yeah, which is beautiful. And the runes as well. I mean, there's ancient roots, but it had to be completely revamped and created in a sense, but that it's like, well, if we're accepting that we're practicing pagans and witches and druids and heathens, the gods are there to inspire us. So
the gods are there. Yeah, I mean, if you're a heathen and you're invoking Odin, he's the master of the runes. He knows everything there is about them. Of course, he's going to whisper things into your dreams. That's what he does, And similarly, the gods have not gone on vacation.
So speaking of going on vacation, when I was advertising this, so for people who are listening to the replay, we are recording this the night of the U.S. election. So we're not going to talk about the U.S. election because please dear no. But we are going to talk a little bit about magic in America because I think it's a fascinating subject, and I'm an American, and you have written extensively, especially recently, about the history of the occult in America, which I think is a really important topic that especially a lot of neo-pagans have sort of ignored, or not intentionally ignored, but had ignored in our trainings or history books. It's just fallen to the wayside. And you've talked about various narratives on what happened to the occult and when it disappeared, or how it disappeared, or if it disappeared. And there was the Enlightenment idea that at some point everyone just decided, oh, well, we've discovered magic doesn't exist. Now none of us will practice it anymore. Yay. Or no, none of the people that we respect ever practiced it. What are you talking about? And those things are not really true. But if you wanted to kind of tell people a little bit about what they should know about the real history of the occult, especially in America, what are some of the main points?
Okay. The first thing, the crucial thing, you've covered one of the crucial points, of course, which is that it is simply not true that one day in 1653, everyone suddenly went, oh, how could we have been so foolish? Of course magic doesn't work. And all became rationalists. That did not happen. And in fact, disbelief in magic has always been a minority view in the Western world. It is the view of a wealthy, influential, and politically very well connected view, a minority, but it is a minority view. Most people in the Western world have always believed in magic, and the majority of them have practiced it. It's that simple. The other crucial thing, and this is the thing that I find that the pagans tend to fall into, is the mistake of thinking that magic all has to do with Europe. Okay. For a while there, I remember in the 1980s, people acted as though all magic had been invented in England between 1887, when the Golden Dawn was founded, and whenever Gerald Gardner finished writing up his first book of Shadows. But during that period, because all of magic, if it wasn't the Golden Dawn, it was Aleister Crowley, it was Dion Fortune, or it was some form of Gardnerian Wicca, or Gardnerian, or Alexandrian, or some other Gardnerian knockoff Wicca. And so this immense world of American magic, which has been going on since colonial times, had been completely forgotten. People just assumed that magic had to do with swords and cloaks and unicorns barfing rainbows or what have you. It was all this very oldie worldy, Lord of the Rings, D&D influenced medieval folderol, which is fine. I played a lot of D&D back in the day, but I also read a lot of Tolkien. But America has its own magical history. There were Rosicrucian communes in Pennsylvania before the year 1700. There were wizards and astrologers and diviners and hoodoo doctors in all over the 13 colonies before the revolution ever happened. some of the most famous figures in American legend and life were deeply involved in occultism of one form or another. We've all heard of Johnny Appleseed. Not many people remember that he was a missionary for the Swedenborgian Church, which was a church founded by a Swedish mystic named Emanuel Swedenborg, which included, back in the day, a lot of magical stuff. Everyone knows about L. Frank Baum, the guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz. The guy was a theosophist. He was up to his eyeballs in occultism. If you've ever wondered why you can take the five individuals who went down the Yellow Brick Road, you have the Scarecrow who needs a brain, that's air. We have the Tin Woodman who needs a heart, that's water. You have the Cowardly Lion who wants courage, that's fire. You have Dorothy who just wants to get back to Kansas, that's earth. And then you have the little dog Toto. You don't need a lot of Latin to realize what that's hinting at. Who's the one who reveals the little man behind the curtain? Toto's the element of spirit. Baum did that deliberately. All of his books are up to their eyeballs in occult symbolism. Nobody thinks of that anymore. People have forgotten about that. But America has this amazingly rich, multicultural, multi-ethnic, just amazing magical history. And so that's one of the things I've been writing about on my blog. There will be a book on the subject.
Oh, excellent. I'm very happy to hear that.
Oh, yeah. The thing is, anytime, a lot of my series of posts on my blogs end up becoming books. It's a convenient way to do things.
You work it out and get to have guinea pigs for
exactly.
Yeah.
And everyone asks questions. Mm-hmm. Everyone asks questions. So I go, oh, I didn't explain that, did I? And so scribble, take some notes.
I would also say that I think that the history of the occult, not to go too far the feminist route, but really it is also sexist, because there's the whole spiritualist movement of the 19th century that kind of gets like, oh yeah, well, we're not going to talk about them, but we'll talk about Crowley and Gardner until the cows come home. And I say that as a witch, as a Wiccan, but it's like, well, we did have all these people that were practicing for a very long time, millions of people, and yet we just don't talk about them because it was primarily women, and we wouldn't really have an abolitionist and feminist movement in the early 20th century if not for those
exactly
pioneers.
The thing is, from colonial times onward, one of the few areas in which women could break out of the sort of the canned gender roles of the time and actually make a unique life for themselves was alternative spirituality. Whether you have Mother Ann Lee, the founder of the Shakers, whether you have Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, whether you have all the early theosophists, a lot of women, Matilda Jocelyn Gage and so on, there was just this torrent of smart, dynamic, creative women who were saying, wow, I don't have to put up with, this incredibly restricted field of action. I can go out and do something astonishing in the world. And they did. And so you have, even in the, even those groups that were founded or largely organized by men, they typically had a lot of these smart, active, dynamic women who got involved, who took important roles, who were very significant figures in the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's just, from the point of view of women's history, similarly, of course, the various ethnic issues, the various racial issues, there were a lot of very, very important African-American figures in the occult scene. I've written about a few of them already in my series of posts. P.B. Randolph, above all else, who just a titanic figure in the history of Western occultism. But yeah, you've got all of these people who were typically coming from very much one-down positions, whether due to their gender, whether due to their race or ethnicity, whether due to their social class. You have people who were like Andrew Jackson Davis, who was the son of the town drunk in Poughkeepsie, New York, and you can imagine what kind of economic status he had. and yet he ended up becoming a really famous leading figure coming out of that kind of class background, because he had some talents for spiritualism. He turned out to be a very good writer. Mm-hmm. And so it's very much this a sort of way around the social barriers of that time, and it's still being used around the very strict social barriers of our present time. It's just that a lot of people don't like to talk about the latter.
Well, it also plays back into the, no, we're extremely rational, which means that magic has not been a part of that. We will ignore those parts of the person's life because they were rational and we respect them, and therefore they didn't do any of that.
Yeah,
or we ignore them altogether
we're all
if
going
we can to scrub that. So
yes. Therefore, we're all going to sit in a circle and close our eyes and make believe.
Yes. So
the world is so much more interesting than that.
That is definitely for sure. So you have a book coming out, which I told you before we started taping that I was sad was not out already, which is going to be called, did I get it correctly? The King in Orange. The
King in Orange. Now, any of our listeners who know their way around H.P. Lovecraft and the weird tales of his time and that influenced him will know about The King in Yellow. Robert W. Chambers' first and far and away best book, and this mysterious, yellow-clad figure who brings madness and chaos wherever he goes. About the time that that Donald Trump began his presidential run, I ended up having a whole series of kind of parallel Lovecraftian novels come crashing into my head, and I published the 11 books in this sort of Lovecraft turned upside down world in which the tentacled great old ones are actually the old gods of nature, and the real bad guys are a cult of crazed rationalists who want to make all that noise about man's conquest of nature into a blood-stained ecocidal reality. It's a wild thing, but at any rate, all of this process, all through the course of writing this, I was reading lots of the old weird tales and so on, and watching what was going on in the political world, watching the very important role of magic in the 2016 campaign, and the far less successful attempts to counter that since then on the other side of the political spectrum. And there was just something so profoundly Lovecraftian about the whole thing, the sense that something very strange had broken loose from the depths and was, rising from drowned Olivier or what have you, to shatter our supposedly rational world. And since, of course, the color of that being was orange rather than yellow, the title followed. But yeah, it is an account of the role of magic and of occult forces in the Donald Trump phenomenon. And I will be finishing it up as soon as the current fracas is over. But I'm pretty confident that I know where things are going, and I don't expect to do a lot of revision. But yeah, that will be out in June. It will, I think it will probably do what most of my best books do and offend everybody.
Equal opportunity in that way, then, yes.
Equal opportunity offender, yes.
Yes.
The Discordian Church, which was an oddity I was involved in at one point to a certain extent, had a character whose title was Offender of the Faith. I always liked that.
Well, I mean, obviously, you're writing the book right now, so I would love to talk to you about it after it's out. But
I will make sure you get an advanced copy.
Oh yay! I would be excited.
I can do that. This one's with Intertraditions International. They're very professional. They distribute through Simon & Schuster, and so they've actually got a first-rate marketing department. So I will be gathering up podcasters and getting them advanced copies and all kinds of other stuff. And I will really look forward to having conversations about it.
Well, just to kind of go over, I remember you wrote a little bit about, I remember some of the articles. I may not have read all of the things that you posted that was kind of in this vein over the last couple of years. But you were talking about how there is a confusion of ideas around the magic that might have gone into the politics of this election and its aftermath. And that a lot of, for example, like the mainstream media tends to lump Wicca and pretty much all magical practitioners into the leftward end of the spectrum, which is true. That is a very heavy, influence on the movement because of, liberalism, and it has a lot of history in our movement. But it's not the entirety. And
Quite the contrary.
There is a lot of magic that was done probably from the the right end of the spectrum, whether consciously or not. Can you touch on a little bit of
Sure.
of that?
Sure. Basically, the thing is, as with most things in our society, the liberal viewpoint gets the media attention. And what you hear of the conservative viewpoint is filtered through the media, the media's liberal lens, and so there's a huge amount that's going on in the world, in America, in the crawl spaces of our culture that nobody talks about because it doesn't fit whatever narrative the media is pushing at this point. A lot of that has been sort of stirring for some time. You had a lot of people in what has vaguely been called the alt-right who actually got interested in magic in the run-up to the 2016 election. They got interested in a specific school of magic at that time, what's called chaos magic, and which the great advantage of chaos magic is that it's fairly quick to learn. And so you had a lot of these people who were these are people who are on the chans, who are on various pro-Trump message boards and so on, entirely off the radar screen of the main society, and they were suddenly going, "Wow, you mean we could learn this stuff and use it to help Trump's campaign? Cool!" And so it got weird because they started doing these things and they started getting these cascades of coincidences.
Yeah.
And the kind of thing that we were talking about omens a little while ago, they started getting a lot of that. And, we saw what happened in 2016. And there has been just this continuous process. I ended up, because I am politically fairly centrist, I am, and by what that means is that I'm perfectly willing to talk to anybody, unlike people in some extremes. And I ended up talking to some of these people who were involved in the great meme war of 2016, as they called it. And many of them went on to start getting very seriously interested in various other kinds of more serious, more detailed, more extensive magical traditions, and they've kept at it. So there is this entire world of conservative occultism that you occasionally hear references to what's called traditionalism, which is a philosophical sort of esoteric viewpoint that mostly European, but has some American supporters. But there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of people who are sort of shut out from the mainstream, the corporate media's discourse and so on, who are very deeply into this stuff, and there have been for a very long time. And while you have the sort of mainstream Wiccan, the sort of big Wiccan organizations and the big festivals and the publishers that tend to put out most of this stuff, who are very much going along with this sort of liberal approach to the neo-pagan movement, there's the other end of things. There's a lot of people, and they're not, pace the usual assumptions, they're not racists. They're not, desperately looking forward to throwing everyone who disagrees them in a concentration camp. They simply have very different political opinions than those that are had on the left, and they feel they deserve a voice. And so watching that process emerge and watching the very clumsy attempts on the part of some of the other people involved to try to squelch that, it's been colorful. It's been very interesting to watch.
So that ties into You've talked a little bit about how we're getting towards the end, but I wanted to just kind of ask you. You've talked a little bit of how you see the interest in these types of occult things kind of goes in waves, right? So we've had waves in the 60s. We've had waves, through Golden Dawn and things around the turn of the century and stuff like that. And it kind of comes and goes in terms of its popularity levels. And right now, I would argue that astrology and tarot is having a moment, and people are really excited about that, even if they haven't been interested in occult things before, which is great. And maybe there's always some movie that comes out and people are really interested in witchcraft again or whatever. So it comes in these little waves, and then it has the bigger waves. And you had written that you thought that kind of that neo-pagan scene was, the interest that was on the wane. But now talking about this and its influence on elections, do you see that as like a separate wave? Is something that brought interest back in because we're now in this rather upsetting and liminal time in our culture, shall we say, for lack of a better term?
I see it as a very different wave. The neo-pagan wave peaked right around 2007, 2008. And you can tell this because sales of books, sales of products, you can probably remember when there were little Wiccan stores, little witch stores scattered all over the place. Most of those are closed now.
Oh, yes. Oh, sad.
And so, yeah, it is sad. I liked those as much as anybody.
I like the little witch shops.
I love the little witch shops. I did book signings in quite a few of them. But yeah, I love the little witch shops. But most of them are closed now because it peaked and sort of started losing popularity. What we have stirring now is, I think, something else, because this is the thing. Waves come and go, and things. What has very often happened, and I'm thinking here of the history of theosophy, the history of spiritualism. You have a period when some new synthesis of occult thought seizes the popular imagination, like the way that neo-paganism did in the wake of Starhawk's book, The Spiral Dance, and Margot Adler's book, Drawing Down the Moon, both published in 1979, and immediately afterwards you had this rush of people going, wow, this is cool. And so everything got sort of refashioned in a neo-pagan mode, and that whole thing had its wave. The same thing happened after 1875, when Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, another of those dynamic women I was talking about, wrote, helped found the Theosophical Society and started writing her books on the subject. Where everything was very theosophical for a while, but that rose and that waned. It finally crashed and burned in 1929, leaving a much smaller Theosophical Society behind. And what happened after that was a lot of the mass interest died and a lot of the media interest died, but you had a return of interest in a lot of the older, more traditional stuff. It was after that that the various Rosicrucian movements really had their golden age in the United States. It was after that that alchemy was revived here. And it was after that that the interest in the Golden Dawn and ceremonial magic really picked up. So I think one of the things we could be expecting to see in the decades ahead is a lot of people turning toward more traditional modes of magical practice, going back to things like classic astrology, going back to some of the older means of divination, going back to ceremonial magic and Rosicrucianism, and all these other traditions that have been around for a long time that are not neo-pagan, but that fill some of the... Hello?
No, I hear you. Sorry.
Okay. I got a really loud beep suddenly.
Oh.
That fill some of the same niche, and that... I just got another beep. Did you hear that?
No, that must be only on your end.
Okay. I'll try to ignore the beeps from here on in. And, that fill the same niche that interest people who 30 years ago would have joined a Wiccan coven. Mm-hmm. So I think, the future of occultism is always bright. There's always been an occult presence in this country, everywhere in the Western world. It's just, it moves in and out of sort of the mass market, and it moves in and out of interest in different things.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's always, especially at times, I would say, I think that it will be even more because people turn to magic when things get a little bit rough. You go to magic because you need to have those methods to hand, shall we say? Exactly.
Yeah. When it's been about a year now. I started doing political astrology forecasts by way of Patreon and Subscribestar, and it's turned into a major thing. It's a significant part of my income. There's a lot of people who really want that. What guidance I can give them based on what the heavens are doing. And so, yeah, in times of turmoil, in times where existing structures seem to be falling to bits and nobody's quite sure what will replace them, if anything, magic, divination, astrology, all these things, they're your go-to things. Mm-hmm. People turn to them.
Well, then that takes me to one of my final questions, which I want to ask you, which is specifically at these particular times, is there anything in particular in people's magical practice or in their divinatory practice that you would give sort of as advice for people to focus on, or that you find yourself doing more of? What would you want people to kind of focus on or to think about? These
are the times when you really need not to neglect the basics. This is where your foundational practices are the things that matter most, because you've got to focus on building a solid life for yourself, building a solid foundation for what you're doing and how you're facing the world, and those basic practices, whether my particular set of ritual, meditation, divination, what have you, every tradition has its basic practices. That's the foundation, and that's the thing you need to build in tough times, because whatever structure you build will only be as strong as its foundation. So that's, get back to the basics, buckle down to those practices, and you'll be in much better shape to weather the challenges ahead.
Mm-hmm. That is wonderful advice. So I thank you for that.
Thank you.
If people want to get in touch with you, or they want to find out about your work, where should they go? Where would you direct them?
I would direct them to my blog, which is www.ecosophia.net. I would direct them to my Dreamwidth journal, which is ecosophia.dreamwidth.org. I don't do a lot of regular social media, and actually I don't do any. And my email address is not readily available, precisely because there's a lot of weird people out there, and I used to get some exceedingly strange stuff in that way. But I can be contacted that way, and I do regular open posts and things like that where people can ask questions and get answers. So.
And you mentioned, of course, we talked about the book that's coming out next year. Are there any other books or things that are on the horizon?
Let's see. There's lots of stuff.
I know there's probably always many.
Yeah. Well, one of my publishers, Llewellyn, the very famous neo-pagan publisher, has been letting go some of my stuff recently. So I've had a chance to redo a number of old books and bring them out again from Eon Books, which is an English publisher. So my book, Inside a Magical Lodge, will be out, I think, in February. The Sacred Geometry Oracle, which I'm really hyped about. It's a set of 33 cards, each one with a symbol from sacred geometry. I brought that out some years ago, but I had no control over the artwork, and it was, butt ugly is a good description. It did not do very well, and so for good reason. And so, but I finally had a chance to reclaim that and get it with a new publisher, with Eon Books, and so that'll be out in April. And I'm really excited about that, because that's a cool oracle. I'll make sure you get a copy of it.
Oh, that's
fantastic. Yeah, and then let's see, what else do I have coming out right about now? I'm kind of between fiction projects, because I finished that 11-book volume of Lovecraft Stood on His Head, 11-book series of Lovecraft Stood on His Head, and I'm kind of going after my long sojourn in Tentacleville, but. That's most of it at this point. I've got some other things coming out further down the road, but that's what's coming out in the near future.
I think that's plenty. My goodness.
I stay busy. I like to write.
Yeah. No, I'm very glad. I think a lot of us are very, very glad of that fact. So thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who submitted some questions. I added some of those lovely questions into what I asked. And thank you, John, for this JMG. I'm sorry. For this fabulous conversation. And I can't wait to talk to you about other projects in the future. So thank you.
I will look forward to it. And thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be on a good podcast.
Oh, thank you for saying that. All right. Good night, everyone. And don't get too obsessed with what's going on out there. That's all I'm going to say. All right. Good night.
Good night.
As expected, a great chat with the inimitable John Michael Greer. We could have gone much further, I'm sure, down the rabbit holes of many of those subjects that we discussed, but I'm particularly glad that we touched on a little the nature of divination itself, as an art that emphasizes relationality and learning to pay attention to the flow and timing of nature. It is really about listening and learning to align yourself in the best possible ways with the forces around you. I agree with JMG that spending time learning and practicing divination is an important balance for our sometimes overly action-oriented ways of being in this modern world. I've included links to JMG's blog, his Dreamwidth page, and a few of his books that we discussed in the interview. And of course, the realm of politics and the occult is certainly in a deeply strange way right now, and I'm sure he and I will hopefully have another interesting conversation about that next year when his The King in Orange book comes out. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you to everyone who joined in live and submitted questions. Please subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy what we're doing here. It really helps. And check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. You can also find me on Twitter, where I am @FiddleAngel. Enjoy your journeys with divination, and I'll see you next time.
'Cause how long was the earth there? How long can we say we belong?